issues that are being addressed. There are a lot of people here who haven't had a chance to come, so I'll just do the brief informal introduction, because as I've said, tonight will be the lofty introduction. So this is the third seminar of our Clarkson week, and so far we've been building up to the big event of discussing the digital today. And Antoine, of course, Picon comes to us from the GSD at Harvard, but he also has an appointment at the Ecole Nationale de Chaussees, so he has a dual appointment. And one of the things I mentioned that yesterday, but not only does he teach at a school of engineering and at a school of architecture, though he associated with the architectural side in this country, he also has degrees in all of these fields, so in engineering, and architecture, as well as architectural history. So it's sort of a unique opportunity for us to really have somebody who bridges all of these disciplines so adroitly. So, has the solution?
No. Okay. So, good morning again, everybody. So, what I'm going to present today are a series of reflections on digital culture, which I'll, gave birth to a book that was published a year and a half ago called Digital Culture in Architecture. But what I'll try to do here is present, I'm still working on that, probably more today on the urban issues. The last chapter of the book was actually on the city already. But I'll probably take a different order and probably present it in a slightly different way from the book. The first thing I wanted to explain a little bit is why an historian like me has taken so much time working on very concrete subjects on a period that we're really in the middle of. Probably because if I try to reflect a little bit of what I've been trying to do, I'm interested in a period in which technological change, social and cultural change, and spatial change are deeply intertwined. And this is why I worked for so long on the period leading, let's say, from 1750 to 1850, which was basically the beginning of industrialization, the dawn of the industrial era, and what had happened to architecture, cities, territories at that time. And in a way, I'm interested in the end of a kind of extended 19th century, with very often the impression I have that what's happening today is probably bringing to an end a certain number of certitudes we had on what was industry, territories, and cities around. So in a way, it's a kind of symmetric inquiry which began actually quite a while ago, or something like 50 years ago. I published a book on cyborgs and cities in French, and I've been working on this subject ever since.
1997.
Oh yeah, you're pretty good. So as an historian, that's what I've tried to bring to the study of the subject, because of course, there are tons of people working on that, is probably a kind of critical distance, which is not always, very often we've had a lot of literature which is raving about how great is the digital revolution, and others have been, like Frampton and others, have been deploring how bad this is for architecture as we do it. So probably I'm a bit more trying to assess what it means, how is the discipline transformed, but not necessarily trying to more in a critical way in the sense of architecture. Second thing, the idea of critical distance is also for me linked, has led me to use a broader chronology than what is usually retained. I'm not starting as early, for example, as Mario Carpo, who thinks that everything began at the Renaissance with the use of the print, the press. Neither there is a philosopher who has argued that digital culture began with the invention of the alphabet. So I'm probably a bit more narrow. But I do think that the beginning of the story is actually not the 1940s, 1950s. It begins before, when societies begin to be driven by information. And this is something that been probably something between 1880s and 1920. society changed, industrial society changed profoundly and begin to be more and more data-driven. These are, for example, the offices of the Prudential Company at the turn of the century, and information begins to spread everywhere. So that's probably a first moment, and if you want to understand what's happening today, I think you need to understand part of what happened there. Second, of course, moment is clearly what happened around 1940, 1950, let's say the computer and later cybernetic moment. Here it's the view of the ENIAC, the first large electronic calculator. And probably the third moment is what has happened probably since the 1980s, 1990s with what we call digital culture. What is important for me is to understand that all of these stages, some will be dealing primarily with what's happening today. They are important connection between architecture, urban concern, and information at the beginning of the century, and then later computer and cybernetics, and today, of course, digital architecture. To take some of Haddad's favorite heroes, you know, Archigram was already, this is Computer City, Archigram was already interested, just like Cedric Price and others, by these questions. So I called this talk, you know, Digital Culture and Architecture, Evolution or Revolution. I actually believe it's a revolution, and strangely, one of the reasons is because it's such a long history. Why? Because in order for something to be truly revolutionary, it cannot be only what happened only recently. It must answer much longer term. For example, if you take the French Revolution, it's a revolution not only because they beheaded the king and a lot of things happened, but because it in a way crowned or completed a number, or corresponded to a number of structural problems of the old regime that it addressed. So in a way, the fact that it's a long-span history is part for me of what makes it a revolution. Was that clear? I think one of the interests of that also is to prevent from the danger of technological determinism. To be clear, I think technology, of course, plays a role, but it's only part of a much broader cultural evolution. In other words, for example, I do not believe that the computer created the society of information, and actually I believe the reverse, that the society of information made necessary at some point the computer. A good proof of that for me is the fact that before the computer we had all kinds of data processing machines, the most famous being the tabulating machines. This is the tabulating machine. And the fact that actually when the computer really started, many companies producing computer were before that producing tabulating machines. So in some ways, what I've tried also to do is not to be too technologically deterministic, because I think in some ways the change of culture, the change in society is probably as important, if not more, than the change in technology. So that would be the last aspect of that. Now, despite what I've said, one cannot but be struck by the changes that have accompanied the diffusion of the computer. And let me remind you how recent it is. I remember a conversation with the late Ralph Lerner at Princeton in 2000, in which Ralph was wondering whether we should wire the building because, you know, there are more and more kids using computer. So that was 2012 years ago. And which means that at the time there were still very few computers in school of architecture, except, you know, the paperless studio in Columbia. Look where we are today. So it has been a very recent, rapid, and very broad diffusion. Now, what should we retain? Can we just put one light off for us so that we can see a bit better? Just one of out of the two. Perfect. Yeah, I think. Is that okay?
It's fine.
So is the digital revolution really that? I will come back to this kind of form, but I would like to take a slightly different start than, you know, the notion of style popularized by Schumacher and others, because this is only part of the evolution. And if we think a little bit about it, most of what is made with computer today, it looks actually more like that. This is actually a project who won a competition on CAD rendering a few years ago, and, you know, a lot of architecture that do not look especially blobbish or trendy or parametric, etc., is actually produced with computer. So I'd like to take a different start, and we'll come back to these forms a bit later. That's a different start than the neo-avant-garde aspect. Probably the start I'd like to take is the more and more strategic character of the project. of design. Let me try to explain what this is. First of all, designing has become more and more loaded with a number of problems, concerns, issues, etc. And in some ways, the use of the computer has made possible to address some of the issues, and also reinforce the strategic character. Let me give you an example. When you typed, I remember on my first book, I typed it, and when I was done typing it, I considered the book was finished. Today, with a word processor, you can pretty much redo it endlessly like Penelope tapestry, which means that by the end, you have to make a decision when to stop or not stop. And in some ways, the computer, the very flexibility the computer is giving us reinforces the need to make decision, informed decision. And in some ways, I would say, before the computer, the technicality of producing a project, using zip or etc., it was so tedious in some ways that the tactics very often eclipsed the strategic dimension. Today, we're very often confronted directly to this kind of strategic dimension. In other words, the why is very often becoming more important than the how in design. And this is a major evolution of the past 15 to 20 years, and the computer has accompanied that. So strategy means also, and speaking of the computer, that you have to make decision about when is something definitive or not, but also decision like who can access information and modify it. And the BIM and the BIM, which are very often referred to, are actually going to raise more and more this kind of strategic thing. BIM is not only a database, it's actually a set of authorizations. And who do you authorize, at what level, when, etc., are becoming crucial questions. Actually, there is going to be a professional battle around these questions, because it's very clear that when the project becomes data, it means that a lot of people want to control the data. So strategy, that explains for me the kind of mapping terms that has been taken by design, there again, during the past 10 to 15 years. That's the mapping is everywhere, and in some ways, traditional design used to try to understand between brackets the context. Now we map the environment in which the design is supposed to insert itself. And of course, NDRDV was among the first that took this kind of mapping turn, but this is very general. Now, the interest taken in mapping goes together with one of the most crucial questions, which is the ambition to go beyond purely formal aspect of design. When I say design is strategic, there is a growing ambition, and the Saving the World syndrome that I've been talking about during the past 2 sessions is part of that. That's to say, we want to consider that design is not only form shaping, it's actually addressing issues, concerns, etc. This is becoming more and more important. So that's all the more paradoxical that in some ways we're in the middle of a total hysteria about form. And you have, in some ways, very contradictory impulses present in architecture today. On the one hand, form is more and more akin to a kind of fashion design thing. It's sign, and the signature logic is one of the bases of the star system, and hence also why Schumacher is trying to convince us that it's a stylistic issue, but stylistic almost in terms of fashion design or art making. Every city wants a Zaha Hadid or Herzog and de Meuron, etc., and lesser practice are also inserting themselves into that context. So it's very deep formalist term. But at the same time, it coexists with exactly the reverse. The conviction that form is not enough, that one must take into account the strategic nature of the project, etc., etc. Is that clear? So that has led to a lot of attempts to try to find a solution to this kind of dilemma. And this is how I interpret, for example, the diagram mode that was prevailing, still, something like 5 to 8 years ago. Diagramming appeared initially, if you take, for example, what Ben van Berkel and Caroline Bose wrote at the time, diagramming was seen as what precisely enables you not to indulge into too much formalism. And I remember in their book, at the time they were writing that, you know, diagramming is the best way not to engage too early into formal decision, but to really deal with the fundamental issues to which design was confronted. Now it's quite revealing that diagramming has not fulfilled this promise. What it has become of diagramming, if we take UN Studio again, if we look at the trefoil diagram, we have in a way moved from a kind of strategic attempt at diagramming to a kind of Beaux-Arts party. Because by the end, what the diagrams that UN Studio finally use today are actually kind of Beaux-Arts party. They're a bit more topological than classical Beaux-Arts, but this is very much that. So diagrams in a way have been disappointing, even if, you know, they're a regular attempt to resuscitate them. So the path now, you know, that kind of inquiry has given way to the so-called parametric and algorithmic, which are actually resuming with the same question, how to go beyond form, to root form into strategic decision. And if you read there again Schumacher, it's very striking that, you know, the parametrics for him is also the way to solve all the problem of the universe, because it's supposed to go much beyond form. And this is a path that has been explored by all kinds of people at a research level, by people like Kostas Terzides, etc., etc. I think it raised a very fundamental, and this is Michael Meredith's exploration of, you know, a kind of scripting and a kind of approach. I think the real question that is raised is, should we still concentrate on the definition of an architectural object like a form, or should we rather try to conceive machines, in a way abstract machine that produce form? And we're back to a question that was raised by Bernard Cache, so something there again like 10 to 12 years ago, when using Deleuze, he proposed to substitute the notion of object, the notion of objectile, as a possible potential for form, a family of potential form, but definitely not form as sculpted or molded in the traditional sense. I think, for me, as an historian, probably there again, I'm both sometimes skeptical and at the same time quite enthusiastic about the perspective opened by parametric and algorithmic, with the idea that, you know, that there is the desire to be both or simultaneously more generic and abstract using these kind of things, and at the same time more concrete, more relevant to a given situation. And I think this is the great ambition of that. What I find interesting is that one of the questions it raises is really, at what level are we going to design tomorrow? Will we still be designing forms, as we used to do for many, many years? Or will we be designing, in some ways, machines, abstract machines that may produce families of forms? And this is, for me, a very fundamental question. And of course, it's easy, you know, culture can be sometimes really weird, and not to say burlesque, but at the same time he raises very serious question. You know, why after all shouldn't we try to think of architecture as a kind of DNA-driven kind of entity? Why not think of growing form following algorithmic procedures? After all, you know, this is what science has done with a certain degree of success, and this is also what artists, this, you know, this kind of artificial life theme, this is somewhere, you know, interactive plants, this is what artists have been doing for a while already. So, for me, it's a real question of this question of what is happening, on what scale are we going to design tomorrow? And I think, once again, that's a question. So we're far from being here, but something that strikes me is, by the end, it's changing the very nature already of architectural form as we know it today. And there again, with a kind of paradox, on the one hand, architectural form is sacralized almost. This is the new project by Zaha, and you have to be reverentious. But on the other hand, form appears more and more as a kind of still, in a kind of endless animation, or a frozen moment in something that could go on forever. And this is what software also does. That's to say, form is no longer a kind of point of convergence. It's a kind of arbitrary or somewhat arbitrary cross-section in a kind of geometric and technical flow that could go on forever. Am I clear on that? Because that's for me a very important aspect of what's happening today. Form used to be still very Platonic regarding form, considering that form was the point of convergence of a design process that can be complicated, etc. Today, form is no longer a point of convergence. It's more, we stop at a certain moment and decide that this moment, in a kind of geometric flow that could go on, a possible solution that could go on forever, this is going to be where we stop. So it has a number of consequences. Is that form appears less and less as something that exists in a static state. It appears more and more as an instance, an occurrence, an event. And this is why, for example, we are still fascinated by Louis Bridge and Marais picture, as if, you know, there again, one of these moments is what has become of architectural form, but this is just a moment. This is why we still have so many frozen surfaces and flows today. These were an early instance with Jesse Reiser, but this is going on today. So from there, I'd like to go a bit further and to propose, and we already discussed that a little bit yesterday, that if form is an event, it means that form happens today. It's no longer, form is no longer, in the traditional mode of being, it's something that happens. Like a discontinuity, like an event, etc. And this is for me related to a very profound phenomenon, which is that information ultimately is event-based. You know, a bit of information, it's not a thing. It's actually an elementary occurrence. And if you begin to think now a little bit of the history of information, computer, etc., the first thing computers were meant to see were actually things that happened. And let me remind you how important it was, for example, this is just to illustrate, this is a François Roche ironic project, but I like this idea form happens in some way. So to go back in the history of the computer, it's very striking how, for example, with the SAGE network at the time of the Cold War, what you saw on the screen was not a static thing. What you saw was a situation, was an event, or a potential event. Hence, for me, this kind of shift from a static consideration of substances to a more dynamic consideration of events and situation and scenario. And which is, for me, one of the most fundamental aspects that happens today. And this is, for me, the basis of this. We discussed that yesterday. For me, the basis of the performative term in architecture is actually linked to the fact that if form happens, it's somewhat commensurate to an action. And actually, form is probably better. We used to think of form as more akin to substance. That was the traditional vision in the history of architecture. What if form become more similar to a form of action? And that's, for me, the root of performalism. Form performs. You know. And that's a very important aspect. Which explains also why architects have made such a comeback in urban design and urban planning, and even planning. Why? Because what is more, planning is really moving from plans, in the traditional sense, to scenario building. And when architects are actually asked to think about the future of cities, they present things that may resemble sometimes the plan, but are actually scenario. Even sometimes weird scenario, like Zaha Hadid telling us what the future of Singapore should be. We might not really believe in that, but that's a scenario. And a lot of what architects do today is actually to propose scenarios, sequences of events, in which forms as events are an integral part of what happens. If you think also of the role of the Guggenheim was as much an event than anything else. An event in a scenario about the regeneration of a Rust Belt city of Spain. So that's something to be taken into account. There are a number of consequences besides this performalist term to this idea of form as an event. The second thing is probably to rethink of the relation between design and its environment in other terms than the traditional project and context. More something like an event in an environment. And there again, if we think a little bit of how we approach ecological problems today, we very much approach them in those terms. and hence also the connection between these new design approaches and environmental question. And last, and probably the most essential aspect for me, is the radical destabilization of form that has taken place. Form used to be, and this is where, by the way, there is still a relevance of the early Eisenman, which, you know, the kind of the deconstructivist Eisenman, because before he began to do ugly things in Santiago de Compostela. Why? Because in some ways, and this is what Eisenman argued for years using Derrida and others, you know, whereas traditional architectural theory wanted to think of architecture and architectural form in terms of presence, there is a radical kind of instability if form becomes an action. Action is unstable. And its consequences can be stable, but as such, it is an unstable thing. So we have today both these kind of super, you know, this kind of hysteric taste and belief in the power of form, and at the same time, this kind of radical undermine. So, and I think this is what we have to think, and this is a bit paradoxical and complicated. Now, why do I think it's a revolution? I do think it's, and I may be wrong, but I do think what has happened is probably the premises of something probably as profound and radical as was the invention of the perspective and the definition of a new type of building that we call architecture at the Renaissance. Why? Because for me, there is a kind of destabilization of a lot of things we used to be sure of regarding architecture. So I'd like just to list some of them rapidly and then move on. The first one is definitely scale. Whether we like it or not, I said yesterday I will go back to that. Form on screens have no scale. No given scale, they seem to float. You know, what is it? Is it a piece of cheese or whatever? It's actually supposed to be a François Roche megastructure. So scale is in jeopardy. Why that? Because of course we live in a period of giant infrastructure, but also micro events. And it's clear, it has been often said that globalization fundamentally is a crisis of intermediate scale. And I think what's happening very often is that kind of thing, a kind of crisis of scale, which is linked to the fact that information has no scale. Information is something that happens at every level, and this is why, by the way, fractals have been so fascinating, because fractals are objects that are scaleless. And this is a fundamental question today. All these things we discover that are scaleless. So another thing for me, which is very striking, what goes with the scaleless? The fact that we actually see relatively precisely two extremes. On the one hand, we see things very easily from very far away. Take Google Earth, whatever. So we see relatively easily at that scale. And this is the left, Los Angeles by satellite. And we see extremely well very close by. And you know, you may note on the right it's the crystallization of concrete. And it looks a bit alike. What do we see at the two scales, these two extreme scales? We see textures, lights, colors, things a bit ornamental, but we don't see classical forms. And in some ways I would relate also the destabilization of form to the fact that today, you know, what we see the most clearly are actually at the extreme. Just like when you do usually the Google Earth thing, you see the planet and then whoop, you zoom and you see the corner of your street. And those are the two reassuring scales. In between, it's complicated, to say the least. So that's for me a radical question, a radical problem. So then something I've alluded to again and again, so I will be more rapid, which is the crisis of tectonics. We used to believe that structure was, and tectonics, that is structure understood in architectural terms, was something we knew about, but actually digital design has actually destabilized that. I took Toyo Ito or Yokohama already, and mentioned this kind of systematic quest for complexity, for almost a lack of legibility that is characterizing today the evolution of the way we think about structure. And in some way also the new taste for complexity. Simplicity used to be a fundamental quality of structure, even if the structure was complex. Today, complexity, a kind of play on our incapacity to make sense of the whole, has become something really important. So this is for me, as I've already mentioned it, the true end of the Parthenon, the death of the Parthenon as a tectonic model. And it has for me, as I mentioned it already, to do with the fact that we tend today to substitute relation to parts, a theme I alluded to also yesterday. There must be a bounty for those who followed the 3 sessions. So I'll be quick on that. So now let's move on. I think it's in evolution with a much more general shift. What I very often describe as the transition from the bicycle or the cathedral to the hamburger. Let me explain. Traditional technological optimization was very much about making the most beautiful conservative structure. In that respect, nothing is more beautiful than a bicycle or a Gothic cathedral. You know, each part is a concert with this idea of minimalism, etc., non-redundancy, etc. If you look at the evolution of technology today, these are no longer values. Why did I use the model of the hamburger? Because you pile up, you know, layers, and you interface them, let it be with ketchup, mayonnaise, or software, but it's about interfacing things that you may have a tendency to pile up. And you know, non-redundancy is no longer very often a value. Why? Because there again, and you know, this is something you find from materials. Why? Because actually technology today is more incredibly layered than it used to be. The bicycle was something that basically you understood only as mechanics. Once you had understood the laws of statics and dynamics, you understood what a bicycle was about. In a way, the Gothic cathedral was the same. Today, you take even the simplest machine, and you take your dishwasher. It's a mix of mechanics, thermodynamics, there are a couple of computer chips, and all that is interfaced, but you know, there is no way you can make it a structure in the traditional sense. So a kind of heap of things. So that explains to me this very troubling also factor that, you know, in some ways ornament, and this is something I'm going to deal with tonight, is actually becoming very often the new guide rule for design. This is an ornament by Gray Lynn. And that, you know, and in some ways in which the ornament becomes general, I'll come back to that, instead of being localized like it was in the typical 19th century project, like here, this is a project for a station. So in which ornament, so I'll come back more in detail, becomes very often a pervasive condition, something having to do with the global geometry of the facade, rather than something that is local in the traditional sense. So another of these projects by Foreign Office, and with the idea that by the end, you know, what is that? Is it a structure or is it a giant ornament? I would suggest that actually it has as much to do with a kind of ornamental property than a classical structural property. Which is then, let's be even more daring, how should we think of the internet? Is the internet a structure or an infrastructure in the traditional sense, or is it a giant ornament made of all these ornamental leaves that we are on the tree of the internet? And I would argue that in some ways what's happening today is basically a radical blurring of the distinction between the infrastructural and the superstructural, between the structural and the ornamental, etc., etc. Those categories are constantly today blurred, and this is part of the complexity of design today. So, this is really complicated. So my argument is that actually a number of constitutive dimensions of architecture as we knew it are radically destabilized. So this is accompanied in the same time for me by the emergence of new questions and possibilities for a refoundation of architecture. So destabilization, but at the same time things which are beginning to be reconstructed. So the first thing I'd like to mention is materiality. You may have understood by now that not only do I link what's happening to culture, but also to the more general evolution of science and technology. We're into that. Is that okay? I'm not going too fast? Good. So, materiality. Let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. Materiality is not something given once and for all. Materiality is actually relational. It's the way we relate to our environment or physical environment. Materiality, it's, you know, we relate to physical object, and the way we relate to it is partial. It's, of course, partially something given by nature, you know, but also something which is partially constructed through our instruments, through experiences, etc., etc. So, when the computer appeared, it was initially seen in the 1940s as a machine to compute. And this was what the ENIAC was supposed to be. And then von Neumann came and explained at length that actually it was a machine that could reason. It was a logical machine. I would say that probably we are entering the third phase in which the computer is a machine to experience the world. Through sound, touch, and tactility, etc., etc. This is one of the Ishiro Ishii experiences on the way to model, and it's immediately understood by the computer in a way, a kind of blurring of digital modeling and physical modeling. A lot of researches, as you know, going on in that direction. So the idea that through the new interfaces, through this very general digital culture that permeates both the way we listen to music, the way we relate to touch, etc., the computer has become a machine to experience the world and the physical world, among other things. Just to understand a bit better this question of materiality, think of the car before us. The car, you know, yesterday, I remember we had an interesting conversation about suicide. I don't know why, at noon. But I'll go back to that in a minute. But the car basically has totally accustomed us to something like acceleration. In the classical societies, traditional societies, things went slowly. If you really wanted to really experiment acceleration, you had to jump from a window. So this is where the suicide comes back. And usually you could not testify to the others of the feeling it created. So it was a relatively singular thing. What mechanical civilization has accustomed us to is actually not so much speed. Of course speed but acceleration. Think of how, you know, very bones were used to the plane taking off, to the car accelerating, etc. And it has in a way totally changed the way we relate to the physical environment. Think also of all this gliding, tangential perception of the world that has come with the car. So the car actually, by the middle of the 20th century, changed a lot our perception of the body. What I'm arguing is that in a way, the computer is doing that at an even larger scale. Because it's not only the kind of mechanics and vision, it's something that extends to a lot of other senses. You know, but even including STEM. You know, there are more and more people doing research on, you know, computer-aided perfume conceptions, and etc., etc. So, also to signal that this is also a kind of existential condition. Think of the car, you know, I always liked a lot Ballard novel Crash, because it epitomizes something that is deeply rooted, that went with the mechanical civilization of the 20th century, which is the mix of empowerment and fragility. When you're in a car that accelerates or a plane that accelerates, there is both an exhilaration, a kind of superpower. We're becoming Superman or Wonder Woman for a couple of seconds. And we feel powerful with a machine behind us. And at the same time, we know we can be crushed at every moment. And there is this mix of empowerment and fragility that there again is something that we reflect on our own body under the light of these kind of conflicted experiences. Am I clear? So what I'm hoping to convince you is that the computer is actually doing things like that. It's reshaping our sensation, and it's reshaping also our very existential perception of our body and ultimately of who we are. So let me give you a couple of examples. We have become, especially the younger kids, totally used to zooming out and zooming in. You know, this is something, and very often I say, you know, the new form of authenticity, to take a Benjaminian category, is actually the non-clickable. The museum is the last place on earth today where you can see non-clickable images. Most of what's around us is clickable, which goes, by the way, with the fact the incertitude on scale. Pretty much, we have become accustomed to the idea that you can zoom in and out on most of the things that surround us. So, I could take other examples of that, but I'd like to, in some ways, how is the computer changing our body? Probably what Stellark and others have repeatedly experienced, which is the idea, and that Bill Mitchell also tried to convey in E++, and before that, which was one of Bateson's ideas in the Steps to an Ecology of Mind, which is the idea that today we extend beyond the limits of our skin. It was always the case through sociability, but one of the things the computer is doing is actually to radically extend our sensorium and our body. And I think this is something now we more and more spread beyond the traditional limits of the body. And this is among the things, just like the car went with this mix of vulnerability and empowerment, the computer goes with a kind of extension of what we are beyond traditional limits of our skin and bones. So now, once again, it's not the technology by itself that produced that. It's actually, for me, rooted, once again, in a cultural and social change. In other words, what has happened with this materiality thing, the redefinition of the body, is what is happening to us and our society. And the computer is part of this transformation, but it's not the only agent in this affair. It has to do, actually, with a lot of other cultural changes. Like, for example, the idea that the world, it has become a very common idea that the world is not populated by things, but by processes. In some ways, this is something we have finally living in the world that Whitehead advocated. And by the way, speaking of event, for Whitehead, you had processes and events, or Deleuze, for that matter. So this is the world that surrounds us. And it's, by the way, quite striking that this is a continuous world. Most of the things we are interested in today are continuous, and digital, usually, tools are discontinuous. So it's quite strange that actually tools that are functioning on the discretization are actually used to understand and foster the perception of a continuous world. All that to say that there again, this is a bit more complicated than what it might seem. Is that okay so far? We've lost no one? Okay, what am I? No, we're nearing. So what I would argue at this stage is that, of course, the core of this mutation is probably what's happening to us. The rise of a new individual, the rise of a new subjectivity, somebody who is equipped, digitally equipped, with new expectation and requirements. And if we remember, that was one of Negroponte's argument, that the digital age was the age of individuality. What I think actually is that there again, this is a much longer history than what Negroponte had in mind. And from the dawn of the information age, what has been brewing is actually a mutation of the individual. So just to show a couple of things, one of the characteristics, one of the tension that has emerged from that age on is a tension between control, a kind of over-determination by state or corporate apparatuses, and a kind of radical freedom of the subject. So let me give you an example. At the turn of the century, when the age of information begins, it's quite interesting that this is the moment when fingerprints, anthropological measurements, all these things begin to be done. This is Bertillon in France, but Galton is experimenting with fingerprints in England around the same time, and you have this huge movement to try to know who is the new individual of the information age. Okay? Now, what is interesting, and Crary has studied that, I think, in quite a magisterial way, is that, and this is fingerprint, is that it's the same moment when subjectivity begins also to find all kinds of means to trick with this kind of determination by state, administration, corporation, etc. And he takes this example, which I quite like, in which you have this woman, and this guy who looks like a doctor or a scientist who's desperately trying to attract her attention. But actually she seems very bored or somewhere else. And Crary has elaborated a lot about inattention The fact that the moment when we begin to try to track more and more what is inside the human mind, how bodies are measured, etc., is the moment in which subjectivity begins to escape, either through psychoanalysis, in philosophy it's Bergson, in literature is Proust, with this idea that, you know, there is something that escapes all determination. So, second moment, with a kind of, well, I don't have time, but with a kind of new heroism of the age of information. This is also when the subject, the time when the subject becomes the guy who deciphers his environment, which is why also the dawn of the age of information is the beginning of the age also of the detective, private eye, is Sherlock Holmes, which is the new heroism of the information age, is to make sense of the clues, of the information of your environment. Which of course raised the question, what's the difference between man and a machine? Which is why also the robot counts so much the turn of the 19th and 20th century fiction, from literature to film. Now second age, the age of the computer, 1950s, 1960s, which are the age of the cyborg. The idea that we're going to couple man and machine, and we're going to know better both, which is very much the Wiener and later kind of utopia. But this is also the age in which counterculture will actually use the same thing to exploit new possibilities for freedom, a kind of radical escape from determination. These are actually hippie experiments of those years. And this is the beginning of cyberfeminism a bit later, and all the Donna Haraway interpretation of the cyborg as something that escapes determination, where corporation and state think of the cyborg as overdetermined. Then radical movement think of the cyborg as, you know, something radically undetermined. And well, and if you take, this is a film I quite like by Verhoeven, which is RoboCop 1, even if it's taken from this TV show, which is less good. If you remember this film, the interesting thing is at the beginning the guy's transformed into a machine, but gradually he reconquers independence and becomes again a subject. So I would argue that this is what's happening to us again today. The digital revolution, we are the inheritor of this formidable attempt to be framed, to be understood, to be put into statistics, into data, into chart, and at the same time radically escaping all that. Which explains to me also why you know, the iPod has been so emblematic of a generation. Because the iPod is the place, is the apparatus in which you can build, you can buy perfectly standardized music. Rihanna, whatever, you know, 99 cents. And you're totally overdetermined by, you know, corporation, etc., that sell you exactly the product they want to sell you. But once it's on your iPod, then it becomes your music. And then you escape into the realm of subjectivity that is irreducible to what was before. So to wrap up, is really the idea that, you know, we are actually we are the inheritor of these past age of subjectivity with new dimension, but with this recurring, ever-recurring tension between determination and freedom, which is a new kind of determination, a new kind of freedom typical of the information age. So what is new today? Probably beside the extension beyond the body, the network quality, the fact that we're no longer single people, you know, unified Cartesian-like subject, the fact that we're a network of very different things. And as you know, the perception of the brain, we have moved from the perception in a way of the brain as a kind of supercomputer chip to the perception of the brain as a kind of internet with modules in interaction one with another. Have some of you read The Ecole Maker by Anthony Powell? It's quite typical of the fiction you find today around the fact that we're multiple. It's about, you know, all these diseases that you can, pathologies that you can understand only if you think that we're not unified, but we're actually a network of modules. Quite typical of today. It's actually a pathology in which you have an accident, you wake up, and your mother, sister, brother comes, and you think actually he's a foreign guy. And worse, somebody is impersonating it. So it can lead people even to try to kill their parents or siblings, etc. Sometimes they believe it's aliens who've taken their place in the appearance, etc. Why do you have that kind of pathology? It's because actually there is one module which recognizes faces and another in the brain which attributes affective value to them. And if they begin to dysfunction, you recognize the face of your mother, but you feel nothing. So since you're still a logical human being, it means it's not your mother. So somebody is impersonating it. And Anthony Powell has built his entire novel on this kind of pathology. His hero has that kind. So this idea that we are not only distributed beyond our body, but we are inherently multiple. And this kind of multiplicity, which is part of the why we are, by the way, impossible to control. This is the new figure of the impossibility to control today. This is actually, made by Jenny Stabin, which he taught at Penn. It's actually, it's not a neuronal network, it's a network of proteins, etc. in the body. But interestingly, it's an image made by an architect in association with a scientist. Just for the pleasure of the eye. So a couple of other things. We are, for example, we are obsessed also by sensorium and sensation. For me, it's not a hazard, it's not completely a coincidence. Digital culture has been so much spurred towards the satisfaction of the senses. With these very sensory dimension, the late-stage restaurant, high-end shops, etc. With this kind of tactility I returned to tonight, there is this kind of tactile quality of the digital, which is related to this kind of new individual. So, to summarize all that I've been saying, and this is a revolution, because not only it is changing profoundly what we knew about architecture, but because ultimately it's linked to a new understanding of who we are and how is society built. That's to say, in some ways, we will have to evolve the architectural discipline because we have become different. And it's not only the computer, it's not the computer who made us different. If we became different in connection with the computer, that's a much more global process. And in some ways, the computer, us, and architecture have to co-evolve. Okay? So, to finish, doesn't mean that we're going to live in a perfect world. There are a number of dramatic questions which are out of the table. For example, the total lack of connection between the quest for sustainability most of the time and the research of the algorithmic model kits, which is all the more surprising than the origin the origin of computer concerned architecture. Take Buckminster Fuller held together these things. Information and environmental, this is also a theme with archigram, etc. And it has somewhat disappeared and it's hard to resurrect. Even if everybody can reasonably understand that, we will really become environmentally savvy when we will be able to really connect the two. But the connection is not done. Other thing, the lack of political and social perspective. For me, digital architecture has dramatically failed. It has been very successful in terms of conveying new individual values. It has been very unsuccessful in really contributing to a political understanding of what's happening today. This is linked for me to this question of the relation to memory that I already mentioned, and with this exception and a few others that have been able to reconnect concrete architecture to the question of memory. This is linked to another thing for me, which is the digital era has been accompanied by the idea that we live in an ever-lasting present. It's, by the way, interesting that cyberpunk literature, before even the invention of the internet as we know it, was already evoking that kind of idea. If you take Neuromancer of Gibson, the main metaphor is the metaverse as a Las Vegas Strip. A world in which a lot of things happen constantly, but a world in which things happen constantly at a high density is a world in which by the end nothing happens. And in some ways we are in the middle of that temporality still. A lot of exciting things happen all the time, and architecture is part of these lot of exciting things. But there are so many things happening that it is as if we were in an eternal present condition. And the only future It's not the traditional 19th century or industrialization future of progress. It's actually apocalypse. We have become apocalyptic, and we strangely are in a kind of temporality which is closer to the medieval age. That's to say, you know, everything will repeat itself until the end of time. Guess what? The end of time is coming. And either let it be ecological, global warming, whatever, but this is the only future. So, of course, the real question, just like reinventing intermediate scale, is how do we reinvent the true future, which is different from the present, but not as different as between being and annihilation, which is very much the kind of dialectics in which very often we are today. So how do we reinvent? I mentioned the ruin yesterday. You know, this question of the traditional tectonic used to relate architecture, time, and history through the question of the ruin. And this was why also I mentioned the relation between Gothic discourse and a kind of historical condition. So this is complicated today. So to finish, by the way, just to a side note, it's very striking for me how very often the new tectonic that is promised to us, from grammature and color to others, is actually a new form of ornamentation. This is actually a giant ornament. So, let me try to conclude. What I would advocate at this stage is we cannot do everything at the same time, but there are a few urgent things we have to do. The first one is that we live in a strange world in which we're diverse, network-like, you know, environment-like, etc. But, you know, if you're wondering whether I'll go to the seminar or not, or, you know, have lunch or not, etc., we still go back to the idea that we're classical human beings and who have to make decisions. If we live in a world of process, but, you know, when I hold this bottle, I still think it's an object. So how can we hold the two? I think part of the task of architecture has always been to help us live both in the world as we think it is and in the world as we used to think it was, which is the world that we need for, you know, a lot of concrete decision. In some ways, you cannot be Deleuzian when you're wondering whether you're going to take the bus or the car. You have to be Cartesian. So how do you live both in the Deleuzian world, because this is what you believe the world is, and in the Cartesian world, because you still have to make a decision as, you know, a unified, not a network, etc. You know, and another take on that, how do we live in this extended gravity thing that video games, etc. propose to us? How do we live that? And the fact that we still have a weight, bones, etc. So how do we both live in the world as we think it is and the world as we need it to be in order to be able to make essential decisions? I think one of the tasks of architecture is to do that. And I mentioned yesterday and the day before the urge for narrative. I do believe one of the roles of architectural fiction is to help to do that. And then a couple of final remarks. We have also to think of digital architecture not as totally open to everything exciting and new, but also reinvent the function of architecture, which is also to shelter. Let's go back to the primitive hut. The first function of the primitive hut is to shelter from rain. Today it's no longer raining drops of water, but raining information. So very often we understand architecture in the digital age as open to every kind of information. But sometimes to protect from the digital rain might be a good function also of architecture, to recreate places of meditation. Just think of the relief, you know, that I currently, you know, have an iPhone like a lot of crazy people, so I keep on as soon as I have, you know, to check what's on, all the time. And sometimes when I have no network, it's great, because all of a sudden you feel again strangely free. So you need to recreate also a function for architecture of places of meditation, etc. Places that protect you. So also architecture needs, I'll come back to that later tonight to readdress the question of meanings. I'll come back to that tonight, so I don't want to develop it too much. So I'll finish by a very paradoxical proposal, which is the following. Architecture is always a fiction. It's a fiction that helps us to live in between what we think we are and what we have the the experience that we are when we have to live. It's not exactly the same thing. Between the world as we think it is and the world as we need to experience it, between a lot of things, and these are the role of architecture as a fiction. And the primitive hut was one of these fiction. For me, one of the tasks of architecture today is a lot of things we believed about architecture are primary. But we still need to reinvent something like scale, which will not be exactly the same as scale as we knew it, but something like that. We need, actually I do believe we need to reinvent something like tectonic. We need to reinvent a lot of things, to sometimes redefine. I mentioned transparency at the beginning of this series of talks. We need to understand what transparency means in the digital age. It's not exactly the same as what it used to be. And so to conclude, we need to reinvent the primitive hut of the digital age. Thank you. Can we have the light back?
Okay, I'll begin. I was reluctant because I did that on the first day. So I think I'm curious to, I'm not sure where this will go, whether I want to make a comment or a question, but I'd like to start at the end, so to speak, with this image and this touch point on apocalypse. And I'd like to, because I think that it starts to raise several questions for me that came up in this lecture, having to do with the nature of the revolution and how it's recognized. So the apocalypse, I think that what you showed, it looked like a mushroom cloud, was it?
No, it's actually the Iceland volcano.
Okay, the Iceland volcano.
Because I didn't want to have the classical rise of water kind of thing, you know,
okay.
Cities feet in the water, you'd see that a lot.
So that was most disastrous for international flights.
And I think it was interesting for me because it's really this notion, you know, a lot of people tell us that to others nature does not exist, we're in the techno-nature, but at the same time we're totally afraid of the revenge of nature. It's very striking today. The revenge, you know, nature is going, you know, to make us pay.
But I think, for me, it evoked another kind of catastrophe, which is difficult to perceive and certainly touches a large scale, and that's climate change. And so I just want to raise that to bring up a few questions. Mm-hmm. So if climate change maybe starts to bring up questions of scale as it's perceived on a global level, and scale, a temporal scale that's difficult to substantiate. So it defies perception for many people because of its long duration, right? So we'll need hindsight to know if we're all goners, right? That it starts to, I think, raise some questions for me about how this discussion of revolution as having both a long lead-in period, but particular relationships to scale and to form we might add qualities to. And I don't know if this simply adds on to or starts to create friction with things that you're putting forward. But I think that to the zoom, for instance, these questions of scale relative to zoom on screen or a satellite zoom, a Google Earth zoom, that we can add things like machine vision, where many kinds of things are more and more capable of being read avisually and then being given data to us that we need to interpret. So visibility starts to shift or continues to shift. And at the same time, some of these discussions of form, for me, broadening, again, questions as have come up before about labor, about how form is also related to our network cells. So there, I'm reminded of this text by the French curator Nicolas Guillot, where after relational aesthetics, he wrote this small book called Post-Production, and he has this little passage about aesthetics after MP3. And he talks about how the assemblage of things today owes so much to both the hacker and to a contemporary DJ that works through sampling not in an analog but in a digital mode, and that the result is one where forms, artistic, musical, computational, whatever, Arab Spring, political, that all of these forms have these imminent, emergent, abrupt, local meanings because of their associations, because of their inherent relations in that moment. And so I'm seeing some, I guess, qualifiers to add on to the revolution, that both scale and form have these additional qualifiers having to do with continuing arrangements of visibility and to relations.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. By the way, it goes, these are good examples of what I call a form as a form of action. You do sampling, etc. You know, what you do ultimately is the form becomes actually the action in some ways. And which is for me also one of the possibilities. Actually, I do believe that once we really understand form as an action, we have a possibility to rethink the role of design in ecology, in environmental issues. But this is still hampered for me by the fact that there is a profound incapacity to imagine the future, except as a slow degeneration leading to catastrophe. Take very often, you know, the role, the discourse on environmental, because fundamentally we're afraid. Because fundamentally, we're afraid that we're going to have to share in the future with all these millions of people out there who don't use batteries at the rate we do, etc., etc. So this is the reason why we sustain the notion of future, because we have no clear vision of, you know, how it could be as good as today. So it's reassuring. In some ways, the couple of, and you know, this is a good country for that, the couple of, you know, eternal present and apocalyptic fear is for me very revealing of that. And it's true that for me, strangely, you know, the digital binary inherited the kind of neo-Coulassian cynicism, that's to say, and I think it's time for it to engage more clearly with questions such as how do we share, etc., etc. Because I think ultimately, global warming is not the real, of course we're afraid, etc. Global warming is not what we're really afraid of in this world. What we are afraid of is to share. Because basically there is not enough metal, rare metal, to use AA batteries at the ratio that Americans and Western Europeans are using AA batteries. If all the Chinese begin to put, you know, AA batteries in their wireless mice, etc., etc., in their all their new gizmos, it's not going to function. So we're very afraid that we are going to have to abandon stuff. So that we're going to live in a poorer way. So, and if we look at the discourse of sustainability, it's very often a discourse on punishment, which sometimes can be transmutated, like in Europe, in a positive discourse, because it's a discourse also on, I'm going to live a totally meaningful life like a monk. So I flush only once a day, and I eat, you know, these kind of, you know, pretty disgusting recycled plates instead of the shiny traditional plastic, etc., etc. And I think this is what we are really afraid of. And you know, it's very striking that digital culture has been actually so far allied mostly with hyper-consumption.
Right.
And that's one of its problems.
I think that there's something to me that of this that echoes Ulrich's risk society. He describes it, at least the way that you're talking right now. He talks about risk society as not existing or living with catastrophe, but with its perpetual possibility.
Yeah, sure.
And that's what binds us. That's actually the collective.
That's the scenario. But for me,
sharing is shared risk.
But this is something, for me, part of a more general thing, which is linked actually to the kind of study I've done on technology, which is the belief that in some ways, why is the narrative becoming also so crucial in so many domains of country life? Because what we are, we no longer believe in a kind of univocal linear progression of things, which we used to call progress, etc. So we build scenario, a different scenario. And risk is part of the way we build scenario, clearly. Yeah.
I have a question about the notion of materiality that you addressed briefly in the talk, which you state is relational, etc., how we relate to the environment, but I can't wonder but be struck by the amount of images that it requires for us to engage with that, and how you see that relationship between the image and materiality. Because when you talk about form as a kind of shift from form to event, it seems to me that that argument is one that really hinges upon the predominance of the image. And so I wonder, is the image really the kind of
it's not only the image. I think the image is part. What I wanted to convey is that actually matter is a very abstract thing. And strangely, we need images to think about abstract things. When we think about the relation to the physical world, it's actually a very complicated question because we access it through images, through tools. You know, one of the reasons images do matter is because our tools are also what construct our relation to the world. Just like the car, the computer, etc. You know, the microscope constructed a totally different relation to the world in the 17th century, microscope and telescope. And they produce images. For a very simple reason, matter as a philosophical notion has no image. It's the old Cartesian thing. So it's constructed, but I think, for example, tactility is a very important also aspect of it. I think, for example, I'm really struck by the return of tactility as a very fundamental sense, and I'm actually ready to bet that it's actually going to be as important as vision. Clearly, it has first touch vision, but it has touch sound. You know, think of the age of MP3 clearly, and tactility is another. I think it touches all these aspects. But once again, materiality is never something given once and for all, and it's something constantly redefined by our culture, or instruments, etc., etc.
I had a question about relevance in terms of architectural relevance. If as you're describing form as action, and action in some ways has become image, and then there's a cacophony of all these images that ultimately these actions don't edify into anything. I also hear in you a kind of nostalgia for form as convergence. And so, I mean, first you're framing it as an opposition, then you're also suggesting there's a kind of possibility in action, but I'm not sure you believe it really.
Well, historians are trained not to believe completely anything. That's, we're great. No, but that's true. We're great paranoid people because the first thing we're trained to do is whatever document we suspect. That's the first thing. You never take at face value totally a document, and then you. So there is always a logic of suspicion. I do believe actually that form as action is not only a matter of image. I think it's something more profound, which is probably for the discipline the first time that it will have to be confronted. The discipline was built on a certain ideal of immortality. And the ideal project was the pyramid. And if not the pyramid, and throughout the 20th century there were people who repeated, we built in time, and etc., etc. This is a lesson that was never accepted. And architects today still try to build monuments forever. I think what might happen ultimately with this form as action is that action do not last as substances. They last as other things. That I have some nostalgia probably, but not as much. It's not necessarily a question of nostalgia. It's more a question of, how should I say, we can seldom, you cannot live in a general relativity world. You live in the old, and I think we have to live in worlds which are very different. The world of our everyday experience is very different, etc. And I think, there is one thing I like with Descartes, which is not the usual Descartes that people retain, is the fact that he was actually a military guy for many years, and he was actually somebody interested in action. And he said, one thing you need is a provisory moral ethics. And that's what I'm actually advocating, that in design, if design is a form of action, design might not be ultimately, because we've also very long believed that design had to found core values and, you know. What if design was about to finding provisory values? A temporary ethical behavior. You see what I mean? For a while. Which is what action requires. Action seldom requires that you have a fixed set of principles forever, because it's not how it works. But you must have something like a compass that oscillates a little bit, and which is what I'm advocating actually. When I say we need to reconstruct something like a narrative, etc., it's something of this idea. Which is, in some ways, if you look at the digital discourse, it has been very much, it's new, it's disconcerting, and it's unthinkable in traditional terms. What I'm arguing is that it's new, it's disconcerting, and it should be, even if it's unthinkable in traditional terms, it should be translatable in something that we can still understand in traditional terms. Yes?
I'm wondering if you could maybe pick up a question you posted yesterday, and that has to do with the relationship between the way things look and the way they function. You started that discourse, and today it would seem that those two poles have moved even further apart.
Yeah, but I think this is the reality of the world in which we live. We live in a world in which appearance and the way things function are very far away in some ways. And this is why I do believe that the space in between has to be filled with narrative. And I think it's, and if you look, you could write a history of modernity in which things have drifted more and more from, you know, in a way, nothing was more akin to everyday experience than Aristotelicism. Aristotle's philosophy, it's a world of substance, a world, it's very close to the experiential world. And I think, you know, modernity has increased the distance.
The reason I ask that is because who is to design that space in between them?
The designers, among other things. I think one of the things that architecture does is actually to provide a mediation between what we believe is true is unthinkable, and what we know is probably not true, but is actually what we experience. And so I think it's a paradoxical function of architecture, but that's one of its roles. Might not be a simple idea, but I think it's actually one of the functions of architecture, which is to be a mediation between what we believe is true and unthinkable, and what we believe is not true, but is actually the way we experience the world. You know, if I'm true Deleuzian, this is not a form, this is a flow. But, you know, as soon as, you know, I take it, you know, so one of the things that design does is actually to provide a mediation between these things.
So architects should design the information space of Facebook. I mean, we live more there than in the buildings sometimes. So is that a new place where you see architecture
No, I'm not
design?
necessarily. I think architect, I'm a bit conservative on that. You know, that was conservative. I don't know, by the way, by the end, if that's so conservative, because actually Bill Mitchell, you know, in the first book, advocated the architect to go on and explore the new continent of the cyber world and design it, which is actually in some ways conservative because it's still the old emergic dream of the architect designing everything. What I'm advocating is, yes, some architect, because they have design capacities, you know, the cyber world is in dire need sometimes of design. So yes, some of our students will go into that world and design it. But I think if you look, you know, the world is not dying because it's not connected to the internet. The world is dying because it doesn't have toilets. They look at a lot of, you know, the fundamental Indian problem today. It's not cell phones. Many of them have cell phones. It's toilets. It's classical space. So I think there are a lot of things to do in the traditional physical space. And of course, in relation with the digital world. Because you cannot separate the two anymore. But I think to deal with the physical world, to deal with the fact that we produce it with computer, to deal with the instability that goes with the digital condition, these are already a lot of tasks for the architects. To understand really what design means, because design as a form of action may be just a motor, and we will still be dreaming to do pyramids. To really understand what design as a form of action means, which means also renouncing to some of the oldest beliefs we have about architecture. you know, the once and forever kind of dream is really something different. Which then opens also the keys to using recycled materials, but to understand also that pleasure is a factor in that, etc., etc. That's what I'm advocating. So I think actually there are so many urgent things in the physical space. You know, take the evolution of cities. We will have to redesign entire, for example, if global warming goes on, among the possible scenarios for Paris is actually very cold winter and very hot summers. The city is absolutely not equipped for that kind of thing, and will have to redesign, pretty much, even the core city will have to be totally redesigned. So a lot of work.
I'm going to have to call the seminar to a close because Antoine has an urgent meeting at Kleinhans to see the building. So thank you all